The grand amphitheater of the Galactic Council buzzed with a low, expectant hum, the air thick with the combined sense of 47 diverse alien species. Each curved wall was lined with holographic projections of their representatives, their unique forms and colors creating a vibrant, albeit silent, tapestry. Cor Bellman, a being of 6 fluid tentacles and an intellect he considered unparalleled, subtly adjusted his ceremonial robes. His tentacles, a symbol of academic gravitas among his people, settled into a posture of profound authority. Today, he thought, a smug smile barely visible on his multifaceted face, would be his triumph. This presentation, years in the making, would solidify his standing as the galaxy's undisputed authority on what he proudly termed primitive civilizations. Esteemed colleagues, Cor began, his voice resonating through the vast chamber, its tone laced with an almost tangible self-satisfaction. It was the voice of someone who had never known doubt, never once been proven wrong. Today, I have the distinct honor of presenting to you the most exhaustive study ever undertaken on the species known as humans. As if on cue, the colossal holographic display behind him flared to life, emblazoning its first slide with bold, unmistakably condescending letters, "Human Species, a Study in Primitive Behavior." A scattering of appreciative clicks and soft, melodious chirps rippled through the audience. The crystalline heads of the Zephyrians bobbed in what could only be interpreted as approval, while the Mter delegation exchanged knowing, almost conspiratorial, glances. "Now, I understand what many of you might be thinking," Cor continued, his voice dripping with an almost theatrical condescension. This was the kind of confidence born from eons of observing creatures he genuinely believed were barely a step above microbial life. How primitive, you might ask yourselves, could they possibly be? He paused for dramatic effect, allowing the silent question to hang in the air, then delivered his punchline with a flourish. "Well, my friends, prepare yourselves to be truly astonished by the sheer, unadulterated simplicity of these barely evolved primates." With another confident click, he transitioned to his next visual, grainy, shaky footage of humans engaged in what appeared to be some form of brutal conflict. "Observe their technological advancements," Cor droned, a dismissive wave of a tentacle accompanying his words. "Still reliant on projectile weaponry. Can you even fathom such a thing? In the year 2387, an era when our civilizations effortlessly harness the very fabric of quantum manipulation, these creatures persist in flinging sharpened bits of metal at one another at absurd velocities. It's almost charming, in a profoundly pathetic sort of way." The audience erupted in polite, yet unmistakable, laughter. The Voran ambassador, a being of shifting sands and crystalline structures, actually slapped what served as his knee equivalent, a gesture considered the highest form of academic appreciation in his culture. "But wait, there's more!" Cor exclaimed, clearly reveling in the amusement he was generating. "Their emotional responses are so remarkably predictable, so utterly mechanical. Present them with an idea they disagree with, and their default settings dictate either a direct, often violent, attack or an immediate, frantic retreat. There is no subtlety, no nuanced contemplation, no sophisticated analysis. Just pure, unadulterated animal instinct." He gestured grandly towards the display, where meticulously crafted charts detailed human behavioral patterns. "Just look at these response times. When confronted with even a perceived threat, they react within milliseconds. There's no thoughtful consideration, no communal consultation with a hive mind, no proper deliberation. It's truly like observing the most basic of insects." The laughter swelled, growing louder and more confident, but something in Cor's peripheral vision snagged his attention. His gaze drifted to a small, almost hidden section at the very back of the amphitheater. There, in a row that should have been entirely empty, sat a single human. A solitary female, clad in what appeared to be some kind of dark, unassuming uniform. Captain Maria Santos, his briefing notes had vaguely mentioned, though he had never truly expected her to attend. Most species, when their very essence was being academically dissected for the entertainment of others, at least had the decency to appear suitably embarrassed. But Captain Santos was not embarrassed. She wasn't angry either. She wasn't even attempting to take notes. She simply sat there, perfectly still, her presence a curious, almost unsettling anomaly in the midst of the boisterous, alien assembly. Her eyes, those unervingly steady human eyes, were fixed directly on him, seeming to catalogue every single word he uttered, every precise gesture he made, every shallow breath he took. Their predictable emotional responses, Cor continued, though his voice had inexplicably lost some of its earlier, booming confidence. A subtle, almost imperceptible flutter of unease began to stir in his stomach. Her complete stillness was unsettling. Where was the expected outrage? Where was the defensive posturing? Where was the typical, knee-jerk primitive response to having one's entire species publicly ridiculed and insulted? Instead, Captain Santos remained perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression utterly neutral. It was as if she were idly observing a mildly interesting documentary about interstellar weather patterns. For the first time in his long and undeniably illustrious career, Cor Bellman felt a tiny, unsettling ripple of uncertainty in his otherwise perfectly ordered universe. But surely, he desperately reasoned with himself, this was merely another facet of their predictable, albeit strangely subtle, primitiveness. Cor Bellman, usually unflappable, found himself surprisingly rattled. He prided himself on his ability to read any species, to predict their reactions with near-perfect accuracy. Yet, this human, Captain Maria Santos, defied all his meticulously gathered data. Her lack of a visible emotional response was, in itself, a response he hadn't accounted for. It was a blank slate, an unnerving void in his carefully constructed model of primitive behavior. The low hum of the amphitheater, which moments ago had been a comforting backdrop to his intellectual triumph, now felt like a subtle, disquieting tremor beneath his feet. The polite, delighted chitters and clicks from the audience seemed to echo with a hidden question: why isn't she reacting? He forced himself to regain his composure, to push down the unfamiliar prickle of doubt. Their inherent lack of complex thought processes, Cor projected, his voice regaining a fraction of its former booming authority, though a keen observer might have detected a faint tremor in his vocal cords. He gestured to another holographic projection, this one depicting a simplified neurological map of the human brain. Observe the relative simplicity of their neural pathways compared to, say, the multi-layered cognition of a Zephyrian, or the distributed processing of a Mter hive mind. He clicked to a new slide, highlighting a comparison chart. Their frontal lobe, while present, shows limited capacity for true multidimensional reasoning. They are creatures of instinct, driven by base desires and immediate gratification. He went on, detailing what he considered to be humanity's fundamental flaws: their reliance on individual decision-making, their seemingly chaotic social structures, their inexplicable attachment to concepts like empathy and honor, which, in his view, had no logical or evolutionary benefit. He spoke of their fleeting lifespans, their fragile physical forms, their absurd need for oxygen and liquid water, basic requirements that most advanced species had long since transcended. Each point was delivered with an air of superior detachment, punctuated by the occasional appreciative chuckle from the alien delegates. Yet, through it all, Captain Santos remained a silent, unmoving fixture in the back row. Her eyes, those deep, unwavering pools of brown, never left him. They weren't accusatory, nor were they dismissive. They simply observed. It wasn't the gaze of an animal, as Cor had so confidently categorized them, but something far more unsettling. It was the gaze of a predator, calm and patient, assessing its prey not with malice, but with cold, calculating efficiency. Or perhaps, Cor's unsettling thought surfaced, it was the gaze of a scientist, dissecting him with the same detached curiosity he was applying to her species. The thought sent a shiver down his chitinous spine. He tried to ignore her, to focus on the nodding Zephyrians and the chortling Voran ambassador. But her stillness was a gravitational pull, drawing his attention away from his carefully constructed narrative. He found himself rushing through his points, his usual eloquent delivery becoming slightly disjointed. He presented data on human warfare, highlighting their inefficient use of resources and their illogical persistence in conflicts. He showed footage of human art, dismissing it as primitive attempts at emotional expression, lacking true intellectual depth. He even mocked their concept of love, labeling it a biological imperative masquerading as a complex emotion. With each pronouncement, Cor waited for a reaction from Captain Santos. A flinch, a frown, a subtle clenching of her hands. Anything. But there was nothing. Her face remained a perfect mask, her posture as still as a statue. It was as if she had detached herself entirely from the proceedings, a ghost in the machine, present yet utterly untouchable by his words. The more he spoke, the more her silence became a roaring presence in the amphitheater, drowning out the polite laughter and the occasional murmurs of agreement from the audience. And finally, Cor declared, trying to inject a note of triumph into his voice, "We arrive at what is perhaps their most defining characteristic, their astounding lack of true foresight. They make decisions based on immediate gratification, with little regard for long-term consequences. Their very planet, a once vibrant sphere, bears the scars of their short-sightedness. A truly primitive species, indeed." He clicked to his final slide, a stark image of a polluted human city, shrouded in a sickly yellow haze. A ripple of murmurs went through the audience, a few clucks of pity, but mostly an affirmation of their own perceived superiority. Cor felt a fleeting sense of victory, the familiar surge of intellectual validation. But then his eyes were drawn back to Captain Santos. She was still there, still utterly unreactive. And then, he saw it. A subtle shift. Not in her expression, but in her eyes. A flicker. Not of anger, not of sadness, not of defiance. Something else. Something cold and ancient. And for the first time, Cor Bellman truly understood fear. It wasn't the fear of a primitive being. It was the fear of a being who had just deeply, fundamentally, and irrevocably underestimated its opponent. The silence from Captain Santos wasn't an absence of emotion, it was the calm before a storm. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment. And Cor, in his academic arrogance, had just presented himself as the most delectable of targets. The hum of the amphitheater seemed to deepen, morphing into a low thrum that vibrated not in the air, but in his very bones. He felt suddenly, acutely, vulnerable. The cold dread that had begun to coil in Cor Bellman's stomach solidified. He had always believed that knowledge was power, and his knowledge of the primitive, human species was, in his estimation, absolute. Yet, Captain Santos, with her unervingly tranquil presence, was dismantling his certainty, piece by painstaking piece. The polished confidence he had worn like a second skin was fraying at the edges. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden, almost palpable tension that had descended upon the amphitheater. The polite chattering of the alien delegates had ceased, replaced by a subtle, collective shift of attention towards the human in the back. Even the Zephyrians, usually engrossed in their own crystalline reflections, seemed to have turned their multifaceted gazes towards her. "This concludes my initial presentation," Cor managed, his voice slightly higher than usual. He clicked off the final, damning slide of the polluted human city. The holographic display behind him went dark, plunging the stage into a momentary, stark silence. "I am now open to questions from the esteemed council members." He forced a smile, but it felt brittle, unnatural. His tentacles twitched nervously, a subconscious betrayer of his inner turmoil. He scanned the audience, half hoping someone would raise a hand, any hand, to break the oppressive silence that Captain Santos's presence had woven. No one did. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the faint whirring of the amphitheater's environmental controls. Cor's eyes, against his better judgment, darted back to Captain Santos. She remained exactly as before, hands folded, posture perfect, her expression a study in serene neutrality. But then, a subtle movement. Her right hand, without fanfare, slowly rose. Not dramatically, not with the urgency of a question, but with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. Cor felt a jolt. A question? From her? He had anticipated anything but. He had expected anger, perhaps a desperate plea for recognition, or even tears. But a calm, collected question? It defied his data. He swallowed hard. Yes, Captain Santos, he managed, the words catching slightly in his throat. Her voice, when it came, was soft, clear, and perfectly modulated, carrying effortlessly through the vast space without the need for amplification. It was utterly devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the emotional outbursts he had so confidently catalogued in his presentation. You have presented a comprehensive, if somewhat selective, overview of my species, Dr. Bellman, she began, her gaze unwavering. You have characterized us as primitive, reactive, and lacking foresight. Cor felt a surge of professional indignation, quickly followed by a renewed sense of unease. My research is based on verifiable data, Captain, he interjected, trying to reassert his authority. She ignored his interruption, her voice maintaining its calm, even tone. You spoke of our reliance on individual decision-making as a flaw, our social structures as chaotic, and our physical forms as fragile. You ridiculed our use of projectile weapons and our primitive, emotional responses. She paused, allowing each point to sink in, not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable statement of fact. The other delegates, sensing the shift in dynamics, leaned forward, their varied forms indicating rapt attention. This was no longer a lecture, it was something far more intriguing. I have no quarrel with your observations, Doctor, Captain Santos continued, and Cor's inner alarm bells screamed. No quarrel? However, your interpretation of these observations is, to put it mildly, incomplete. And dangerously so. A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Dangerously incomplete? This was a direct challenge to Cor's academic infallibility. His tendrils began to twitch uncontrollably. You presented our predictable emotional responses as a weakness, Captain Santos stated, her eyes locking onto his. Tell me, Doctor, if a species consistently reacts to a direct threat with immediate, decisive action, is that a flaw, or a highly efficient survival mechanism? Cor opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. You spoke of our primitive projectile weapons, she continued, her gaze now encompassing the entire council. Yet, were these not the very tools that allowed us to defend ourselves against far technologically superior aggressors in our early history, forces that underestimated our capacity for innovation and adaptation? A few of the older delegates, particularly those from species with long, conflict-ridden histories, exchanged knowing glances. The point landed with subtle but undeniable force. You dismissed our individual decision-making as chaotic, Captain Santos pressed on, her voice still calm, yet now carrying an undeniable current of power. But consider this, when an individual faces a novel threat, without the need for consensus or hive-mind deliberation, is not swift, independent action a profound strength? Especially when that action is fueled by a desperate will to survive? Cor felt a cold sweat break out on his chitinous skin. He had dismissed these flaws with such certainty, but she was reframing them, turning his perceived weaknesses into formidable strengths. And as for our fragile, physical forms and short lifespans, Captain Santos concluded, her voice now possessing an almost chilling resonance, perhaps it is precisely this fragility, this acute awareness of our own mortality, that fuels our relentless drive, our boundless adaptability, and our capacity for innovation. When every moment is precious, every challenge becomes an opportunity for growth, for evolution, for survival against impossible odds. She finally lowered her hand, her gaze still fixed on Cor. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute, a profound stillness that was no longer unsettling, but truly awe-inspiring. Cor Bellman, the galaxy's foremost expert on primitive civilizations, found himself utterly speechless, his meticulously constructed edifice of academic arrogance crumbling around him. The primitive human had just delivered a masterclass in intellectual reframing, and she hadn't even raised her voice. The underestimation, Cor realized with a sickening lurch, had been entirely on his part. And the true demonstration, he sensed, was only just beginning. The silence that followed Captain Santos's quiet reframing was unlike any Cor Bellman had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of polite attention, nor the hushed awe of a captivated audience. It was a dense, almost suffocating silence, pregnant with the weight of revelation. Every single delegate in the amphitheater seemed to be holding their breath, their eyes, in their myriad forms, fixed on the human. Cor felt his own internal mechanisms seizing up. His academic mind, trained for logical progression and predictable outcomes, was short-circuiting. She hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, hadn't even shown a flicker of the primitive, emotional responses he had so confidently catalogued. Instead, she had simply exposed him. Not with aggression, but with a cold, surgical precision that left him feeling utterly flayed. His gaze flickered between her unwavering stare and the now silent council. The Zephyrians, whose crystalline structures usually refracted light playfully, seemed to absorb it, their forms unusually still. The Mkter, typically a bustling collective of consciousnesses, were eerily quiet, their individual units perfectly aligned. Even the jovial Voran ambassador had ceased his characteristic movements, his sand-like form frozen in mid-flow. "You spoke of our lack of true foresight, Dr. Bellman," Captain Santos continued, her voice cutting through the stillness like a finely honed blade, not loud, but piercingly clear. She did not wait for a response, nor did she seem to expect one. "You showed an image of a polluted human city, an undeniable truth from our past. But what you failed to present was the follow-up." She raised her hand again, this time pointing not at Cor, but at the now dark holographic display behind him. There was no visible control panel near her, no device in her hand. Yet, as her finger extended, the massive screen flickered. A gasp, a collective intake of various respiratory fluids, rippled through the audience. The screen, which Cor had believed to be under his sole control, sprang to life. It was a panoramic view, not of a polluted city, but of Earth. But this Earth was vibrant. Lush, sprawling forests covered vast continents. Oceans, a breathtaking azure, teemed with life. Crystal-clear rivers snaked through verdant valleys. And in the background, orbiting gracefully, were colossal structures, not the grimy, smoke-belching factories of the past, but shimmering, elegant orbital habitats, each a self-sustaining ecosystem. They glowed faintly, powered by what looked like captured starlight. "This," Captain Santos's voice resonated, still calm but now imbued with a quiet power that commanded absolute attention, "is the same planet, Doctor. The same, primitive, species. This is the Earth of today. The result of that lack of foresight you so confidently asserted." Cor Bellman felt his multifaceted eyes widen in genuine shock. His research, gleaned from ancient galactic archives and observational probes, was a decade old, at best. He had dismissed more recent, fragmentary reports of Earth's recovery as anomalies, statistical noise. But this was undeniable. The sheer scale of it, the breathtaking beauty of a world not just healed, but transformed. "When faced with the consequences of our actions," Captain Santos continued, her gaze sweeping across the stunned council, "we did not simply attack or flee. We adapted. We innovated. We faced our self-inflicted wounds head-on, not with brute force, but with a collective will you perhaps deem too chaotic to be effective." The holographic display seamlessly shifted again. Now it showed detailed schematics of the orbital habitats, intricate designs that utilized advanced fusion technology and closed-loop ecosystems. Then, it zoomed in on what appeared to be massive, swirling structures in Earth's upper atmosphere, atmospheric purifiers, tirelessly working to undo centuries of damage. Footage of vast, automated reforestation projects played out, showing drones planting billions of trees with pinpoint accuracy. Images of deep-sea restoration efforts, of species brought back from the brink of extinction through genetic engineering, filled the screen. You labeled our attachment to empathy and honor as illogical. Captain Santos's voice was a soft counterpoint to the awe-inspiring visuals. Yet, it was precisely these primitive emotions that fueled our determination to heal our planet, to protect the very life we had jeopardized. It was empathy for future generations, and a sense of honor for the world that sustained us, that drove our greatest advancements. The Voran ambassador, completely unbidden, made a low, guttural sound, a sign of profound respect in his culture. Even the usually stoic Zephyrians emitted faint, harmonious chimes. Cor Bellman could only stare. The sheer scope of humanity's rehabilitation efforts dwarfed anything his own, superior, species had ever attempted. His comfortable, arrogant worldview was being shattered, not by an explosion, but by a whisper, by a silent, undeniable demonstration of power. "We may not possess hive minds, Doctor," Captain Santos concluded, her voice gaining a quiet, almost dangerous edge, "but our individual will, when united by a common purpose, can move mountains. Or, in our case, restore worlds." She lowered her hand, and the holographic display froze on a serene image of a fully restored Earth, a testament to a species Cor Bellman had dismissed as primitive. He felt a deep, chilling understanding settle upon him. Her silence, her composure, her lack of expected, primitive, reactions, they were not signs of simplicity, but of an incredibly potent, unseen force. And he, the expert, had been utterly, catastrophically blind to it. The game, he realized, had just begun, and he was already losing, silently.